Lamborghini is often thought of as that ancient dinosaur of a company with their big, naturally aspirated V12s. But if you look through their back catalog, you'll find they're one of the most forward-thinking supercar makers in the world. From the creation of the mid-engine supercar with the Miura, to experimentations with turbocharging the Countach. But their most radical, forward-thinking project ever wasn't a supercar. It was the Rambo Lambo, the LM002. Now, the story of the LM002 is long and winding, so we're going to go all the way back to the origins of the idea, the 1970s Cheetah Project. Mobility Technology International (MTI) was awarded a contract for the US military to design one of their new replacements for, like, the Jeep, an off-road troop transport truck, if you will. And like the good American company that they were, they outsourced its construction to Lamborghini, of all people. And after quite a bit of development, Lamborghini unveiled the Cheetah at the Geneva Motor Show in 1977, which must be the only US military prototype to ever be revealed at the Geneva Motor Show. But in attendance in the Geneva show's crowd was a little company called FMC, who saw some very similar design details from their 1970 XR311 and threw a little bit of a legal fit. But it didn't matter anyway because neither the XR311 nor the Cheetah were selected by the military, and they chose the Humvee by AM General. Now, the Cheetah was actually pretty advanced. It was fiberglass with a rear-mounted Chrysler V8. So on paper, it was very high-tech, which is something you think the military would like. However, the rear-engined placement of strangeness in the military vehicle made the handling atrocious, and since it was a Chrysler engine from the 70s, it made just 180 horsepower, which was woefully inadequate for the 2.2-ton curb weight. So Lamborghini not only didn't get the contract, it also led to a snowball effect that nearly killed the company. The money they poured into it and the no contract ruined the company financials, and it ultimately led to them losing another contract for BMW, which meant that they lost their military contract for the car, and they lost their BMW contract for their M1 supercar engine. So they ended up getting new investors in the 1980s, and for some reason, these investors had a belief in the Lamborghini off-roader idea. But not for the military, for the civilian population. It still had a rear-engined AMC V8 for some reason, and they thought the handling would be different, and it wasn't, so only one was made of this LM001 concept, for good reason, I guess, because it sucked. But 1 year later, the LMA002 came out, and Lamborghini started to figure out this whole car thing. They replaced the underpowered V8 with a Countach V12, making 332 horsepower, and they put it in the right spot for a truck, which not only opened up the room for 11 people in the cabin, it also meant it worked. And then when you combine that with the reworked suspension, the reworked tubular space frame chassis, and the locking differentials, you had a bona fide off-roader on your hand. In fact, the Saudi military was actually looking to purchase 500 of them, but that order never materialized. Regardless, the LMA002 was a seal of approval for the off-road Lamborghini. They proved that they could do it successfully. So 4 years later, the LM002 arrived. This was an iconic machine. It looks very good for an 80s off-roader. When you look at the Grand Wagoneer, you're sort of seeing a box, but this is a very aggressive box. Sort of like, I'm gonna punch you in the face. It was called the Rambo Lambo, for Christ's sake. But that being said, it was not exactly bare bones. It was fully decked out in leather with a premium stereo on the roof and tinted power windows in the 80s. That is very high-tech. And the off-road capabilities was no slouch either. It had massive off-road suspension, custom Pirelli tires specifically designed to run flat and operate very well in the desert heat. It could even have sand spec tires specifically for going through the sand dunes. Then we had the engine. The Countach V12 was upgraded to 455 horsepower and 370 foot-pounds of torque. That propelled the 6,800-pound skyscraper to 60 in 7.7 seconds at a top speed of 120 miles per hour. That is insanely fast for the time. It's pretty fast nowadays for SUVs. And this was in the 80s. Now, that did come with a minor downside. You had a 45-gallon fuel tank because I'm pretty sure the MPG was measured in gallons per mile. But if the Countach V12 wasn't enough for you, there was an even crazier option. This is Lamborghini after all. I'm talking a 7.2-liter L804 V12 from Lamborghini's Class 1 powerboat program. You could get an honest-to-God powerboat engine in your SUV. It made 720 horsepower. Sure, it ruined the weight distribution and burned even more fuel than the Countach engine, but it's a powerboat 700 horsepower V12 in a car that you could buy. That is awesome. Now, you could buy it, but nobody did. It cost $120,000 in the 80s, and only 328 were produced, and because it was the 80s, the world was not ready for a sport SUV. This is the first ever sport SUV, and nobody liked it, because SUVs had just started to exist. That being said, those who did buy it, well, that's a pretty impressive cast of characters. We got Mr. Stallone, Escobar, Gaddafi, Hussein, and the Sultan of Brunei, who ordered a one-off estate version because of course he did. Now, Gaddafi didn't just order one. He actually ordered 100 of them for the Libyan army, and you can actually tell if yours is an ex-Gaddafi spec by opening the back seats. I'm guessing to allow for easy access in and out and not to stick a machine gun out of. As for Saddam Hussein's, well, you can't buy it anymore because, in a rather pity act, I will say, the US military blew it up as part of a controlled demolition in 2004. Just a bit petty, just a bit. Now, I mentioned this was prepped for the sand dunes with its custom tires and its big off-road suspension. So you'd think they would take this off-road racing like the Land Rovers and G-Classes and all that. And they sort of did. 2 of them were built for the Dakar Rally in 1988, and they were properly kitted out. Roll cages, racing suspension, plexiglass windows, GPS technology, and the V12 was upgraded to 600 horsepower before stripping everything else out. But these never really raced. They competed in 1 rally in Egypt and 1 rally in Greece before funding ran out. Now, this is the end of the LM002, but it's not the end of the LM model range, strangely. And LM003 was conceived for military purposes, which meant ditching the expensive and inefficient V12 for a 3.6-liter turbo diesel 5-cylinder, which was terrible, so they scrapped it. But they didn't give up. They tried with another civilian model, the LM004, with a better interior and a 400 horsepower 7-liter V12. But again, the engine was terrible and they scrapped the project. Fast forward the better part of a decade, and 2006, the LM005 Legarcho was thrown around, and it was supposedly gonna have the Murcielago 620 horsepower V12, but this never even got past the conceptual stage, which means we would have to wait until 2019, 30 years after the LM002, for a new Lamborghini SUV. Sort of. You see, the chassis was the same as the Bentayga, the electronics are from an Audi Q7, and the engine is a twin-turbocharged V8 from the Porsche Panamera. It's a very good twin-turbocharged V8, making 641 horsepower, and it means it can hit 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds at a top speed of 190, but it's hardly a Lamborghini outside of styling. Now, those performance figures are insane. For a 5,000-pound SUV, that is immense. And in order to stop that immense amount of speed, you need an immense amount of brakes. Specifically, the largest carbon ceramic brakes in the world at 17 inches in diameter. That's insane. The only thing more insane than that, I would say, is its success. You see, unlike the LM002, which launched decades before it was ready, the Urus entered at just the right time. Which means that now over 60% of new Lamborghini sales are the Urus. That's over $1 billion. And yes, because this is Lamborghini with the crazy mad stuff, there is a racing version called the STX, which is apparently starring in a one-make racing series alongside the Super Trofeo Cup. Like the LM002 Dakar truck, this is fully kitted out, but this is for the racetrack, the tarmac, which means it's got a full roll cage, fire suppression, endurance class fuel tank, bigger air intake, custom racing tires, bigger 21-inch wheels, and a 25% reduction in curb weights. I may not like SUVs, but this is probably the best one out there. Except for the Pajero Evolution, but that's not the point. So, if for just a second we can compare the LM002 and the Urus, it's a bit like comparing father to son. The father is much bigger, got a bigger engine, bigger muscles, if you will, and is more chiseled, old-fashioned, while the kid is much more high-tech, much faster, much more advanced in many ways, and looking towards the future. But I think the biggest comparison we can draw is the release dates. The Rambo Lambo was decades ahead of its time. Literally decade. It came out 33 years before the Urus. And yet, I would argue it's a more impressive car. The Urus is technically faster and better and lighter and more affordable, especially because the LM002s are like $250,000 now. But I would rather have the Rambo every single time. It's got more character from the V12, it's more eccentric, only 328 were ever made. They were owned by some of the quirkiest and not most brutal owners of any car lineup in history. And it's got one hell of a crazy story ranging from military contracts to failed rear-engined AMC things. And I think that really adds to the character of it. Plus, it's one of the most forward-thinking cars since the Lancia Lambda. It's an incredible machine that never gets enough credit, and we're only now starting to realize what we had before it was gone.